Thank you all for coming, especially students. I understand it is your last day of classes, 3 o'clock Friday afternoon. You are amazing. It's wonderful to be back in Virginia and to be here at the invitation of an English department. I started out in English at Yale and I moved to religious studies at the University of Virginia. And I tried to do religion and literature after leaving Virginia. For the next 10 years or so after getting my degree, I felt like an interloper in both departments, English and religion. But the conversation about religion and literature has become much richer in the last decade or so, and certainly that is the case here. The people that I've spoken to, the people whose work I've had the privilege of discovering more about. So I'm delighted to be here. This is wonderful company to be in. I will speak today, as I do in Culture and Redemption, as an Americanist, that is, a student of American literature and American religion. In a reflection on the many years she spent writing The Invention of World Religions, the brilliant religious studies scholar Tomoko Masuzawa remarked that, quote, working alone in the library basement for a very long time does have a way of making one feel like a loser. This is a feeling to which I can give ample testimony. When I first interred myself in the basement stacks to begin writing Culture and Redemption, it often seemed to me that I had no interlocutors who were not dead or imaginary, and that on slow days even they would get bored and disappear, leaving me alone to write for some future audience I could only conjure by hoping for. Above ground, however, a rich discussion about secularism was just then starting to build, not only in sociology, where I vaguely remembered having left it, but now too in literature, philosophy, intellectual history, and American religious studies. And so somewhere in the process of writing about American literature, religion, and secularization, I had been lifted out of loneliest scholarly solitude and given a place in a vibrant and continuing conversation across a number of fields. This is as good and gracious a thing as has ever happened to me as a scholar, and remains so, whatever my part in the disagreements that sustain our discussions. I want here to offer some very tentative thoughts on a strand of the conversation about secularism and literature, by which I'm now and then made uneasy. This is the advent of the post-secular, a term we sometimes hear where we might earlier have heard postmodern as a description for a particular condition or predicament of our age. And like postmodern, with its hipster flash of approval for the condition it names, post-secular also on occasion implies an answer to, or at least a right way of navigating the dilemmas it describes. It's this corrective, even redemptive function of the term that interests me here, those places where the problem of the post-secular can turn on a dime and become the solution of the post-secular. So the problem of the post-secular. I'll be speaking for about 30 minutes. What are we to do with the sacred? That's in quotes. Literary scholar Jonathan Friedman recently poses this as what he calls, quote, a great unanswered question of contemporary literary criticism. Those of us present here today might frame the object differently or dispute its status as virgin terrain. In a 2010 issue of Early American Literature, literary historian Justine Murison notes that, quote, the religious turn in literary studies, taking place since the late 1990s, but reimagined in more urgent terms following September 11th, has made a discipline-wide fashion of what had long been one of the most bread and butter concerns of our field, early American studies. Yet, as Friedman voices it here, the question of the sacred seems to perplex and to hush, as though it were a daring and destabilizing inquiry for literary scholarship even to pursue. Perhaps this speaks to the formative power of the secularization narrative on our discipline. Critic Michael Kaufman has argued that a tacit ban on engaging religion, except when we find it lodged deep in the past, where presumably it belongs, is not incidental to what scholars of literature do, but instead goes deeply to the making of professional identity. From Emerson and Matthew Arnold to Robert Scholes and Gerald Graff, the story told in literary studies of its own emergence as a discipline is a supersessionary tale, in which religion cedes authority to forms of truth and suasion that no longer require its grounding. To scholars of American literature, in particular, the secularization story has functioned both as institutional history and professional credo. For all its unfashionable teleological inevitability, its brash aspirations to universality, the in-house account of advancing secularization has long remained the one progress narrative to which the professional study of literature has attached its own discourses and aims. Recent interest in secularism among literary scholars would seem to mark a new departure, insofar as it considers the secular as an historical formation and not a default position, a methodological template, or a reliable account of the way things simply are. I want to think today about how it does and how it doesn't. That is, how the narrative project of secularization continues to drive even the newer post-secular plots that would disturb it. The term post-secular crops up in the social sciences to take note of an apparent paradox. In the United States, the secularization thesis seems amply confirmed at the level of institutions, the academy not least, even as religious motivations, appeals, and symbolic structures have all but saturated our public culture. We can't really describe this as a regression or return, because these new ways of being religious are often steeped in processes we had come to think of as secularizing, including the formation of nation-states, the rise of the autonomous individual, the advance of capitalism, and the emergence of liberalism as a privileged subjectivity and mode of governance. The more carefully we take stock, moreover, the more it appears that these secular formations in the West are themselves bound up in particular religious trajectories. On a global stage, secularization, which once seemed inevitable, has come to look increasingly contingent and embattled. So our categories no longer work as cleanly for us. We can't jettison the secularization thesis entirely, but we need to acknowledge a great deal that it doesn't explain. In this context, the post-secular describes an environment in which available models no longer serve us and signals the need for new ones. Framed as an analytic dilemma of this sort, the term post-secular stands in for a lack it does not presume to remedy. A lot of fruitful work in the humanities, meanwhile, considers the implication of this predicament of the post-secular in our experience and scholarly practice. Philosopher Martin Matustik, for example, suggests that the post-secular condition is particularly illuminated by the question of forgiveness, as this plays out in truth commissions, for example. Since in a purely secular world, neither the possibility nor the impossibility of forgiveness could ever obtain. Every evil or affront could be cashed out somehow and made restitution for. Everything would have its price. Literary scholar Vincent Pecora also invokes the post-secular as a placeholder for this remainder or excess, for what stubbornly resists the Enlightenment project of translating the truth values of religion in terms of the secular truth values of science, philosophy, and the arts. Without citing the post-secular by name, Charles Taylor expounds at length on our secular age and its particular ennui, the sense it induces that, quote, somewhere, in some activity or condition, lies a fullness, a richness. That is, in that place, activity, or condition, life is fuller, richer, deeper, more worthwhile, more admirable, more what it should be, end quote. In these and like examples, the predicament to which the term post-secular is fastened is existential as well as analytic. That is, the inadequacy of secular frames to lived experience is felt not simply as a theoretical or methodological shortcoming, but as a potential crisis of meaning. As the late theologian Charles Winquist described his own project of weak or deconstructive theology, quote, the dominant culture in Europe and North America is secular, and the readers that I envision are deeply influenced by this culture. They would almost never read theology. but they might approach its periphery through interests in the arts, literature, or even various New Age spiritualities. Those for whom I write are restless. They have noted an absence in their lives, but it is not an absence that can readily be filled by institutionalized religion." End quote. This space of absence, I suggest, is also the place where the post-secular is now occasionally offered as a solution to the problem it names. Intimations of secular emptiness become post-secular occasions for fullness. The crisis of disenchantment, an invitation to re-enchantment. The absence of belief, itself an object of belief. For those who write in this vein, the post-secular is given as an interpretive stance, a skill set, a hermeneutic, a tonic, above all, a discovery. Literary scholar John McClure, for example, describes his book Partial Faiths, Post-Secular Fiction in the Age of Pynchon and Morrison, as, quote, "a book about unorthodox ways of being religious in the late 20th century, and at the same time a book about postmodern literature. What sparked it as an academic project was my sense that there was something hiding in plain sight in a great deal of the most powerful literature of the last 50 years. Among them writings by Thomas Pynchon, Don DeLillo, Ishmael Reed, Toni Morrison, and Louise Erdrich." And that involved a set of narratives about secularized protagonists who undertake a kind of turn to the religious, which is not in any simple sense a return, but rather an attempt to discover a space between dogmatic religiosity on the one hand and dogmatic secularism on the other, end quote. Literary critic Everett Hamner elaborates on McClure, quote, "Post-secular thinking, and by extension post-secular fiction, enables interpretive agility about traditional religions and spiritualities by complicating fixed meanings, embracing ambiguities, and recognizing how across history and geography, mystically inflected language is regularly inscribed within secular statements of identity and purpose." Still quoting, "This theoretical approach eschews not only the apocalyptic rhetoric of extremist positions, but also the assumption that religious and scientific approaches to questions of ultimate meaning are necessarily incompatible," end quote. We might take issue with the implication that the place of religion in a literary work can be reduced to mystically inflected language, or questions of ultimate meaning, or that religion and the secular represent fixed poles, or that the space between them is necessarily risky and uncharted terrain, a strait of Scylla and Charybdis to be heroically navigated by the post-secular author or critic, and not where most of us may in fact live out our day-to-day lives. These reservations aside, however, what these post-secular literary critics are up to does look a lot like what many contemporary scholars of American religion are up to, though the sources there are more likely to be historical or ethnographic than literary. An interest in off-the-grid spiritualities, in figures who depart from or look beyond institutional religious frameworks in order to live in ways that seem nevertheless driven by religious desires, animates some of the best work in American religion to come in recent years from scholars like Jeff Kripal, Lee Schmidt, Catherine Lofton, Courtney Vender, Catherine Albanese, and many others. But what the post-secular turn in literary studies feels even closer to than to these recent studies in American religious history is the subfield of academic religious studies that began in the 1960s and 70s to call itself religion and literature, or as I learned to refer to it as a graduate student in one of its last outposts, R&L. Early proponents of R&L tended to share the new critical formalism of those who preferred their literature neat, unsullied by historical and political context, as well as the Protestant or post-Protestant theological modernism of those who, like Paul Tillich, saw culture and the arts as privileged sites of religious meaning. What these scholars sought in great literature, not always or ever overtly religious literature, was the glint it might return to us of, capitalize this string of words, being, presence, transcendence, ultimacy, the really real, the wholly other, the mysterium tremendum, etc. To this cadre of scholars, the discovery of the mysterious tincture of the sacred in erstwhile secular literature confirmed the greatness of the work in question, blessing its aspirations to canonicity, while also testifying to the near definitional persistence of the sacred in a secular age. Where the newer post-secular criticism most differs from this scholarly disposition is in the former's friendliness to popular culture and to postmodernism, both of which old school religion and literature all but passed from this world in decrying. Proponents of RNL typically sought to translate venerable, almost exclusively Christian theological terms into purportedly secular cultural ones. The newer post-secular critics, by contrast, seem more or less content to reproduce religion in what I think of as the bookstore vernacular. So imagine walking into Borders, a jumble of wildly disparate traditions, periods, and practices shelved between magic and the occult at one end and self-help at the other. So the protagonist of post-secular fiction in McClure's readings pivots from the supernatural to the therapeutic and back again, by way of the easy mix of religious materials she might draw from. Thus, what brings Sue Monk Kidd's best-selling The Secret Life of Bees into the company of Toni Morrison's Beloved for McClure is that the return to the sacred each narrates in the lives of its characters is not, importantly, a movement, quote, back towards some kind of easily recognizable institutional religiosity, but back into modes of being that take into account a multiplicity of religious practices, powers, and postures, end quote. The flickerings of the sacred in such works are occult, not only in their honoring of unseen powers, but in their remaining hidden by choice or necessity below the sight line of institutional faith and out of hearing of its ready articulations. This religiously inchoate register becomes a space of spiritual self-fashioning from the resources of, quote, any number of traditions without the sense of being subjected to any one of those traditions in its dogmatic or doctrinal purity, end quote. Literary scholar Amy Hungerford also attends to works of contemporary American literature in which, as she puts it, quote, meaning drops away from language to create a formal space that we find filled with religious feeling, supernatural power, otherworldly communion, and transcendent authority, end quote. Hungerford's book, Postmodern Belief, takes up meaninglessness as both a spiritual predicament and a particular type of literary form. The fact that it is now, quote, impossible to practice any religion without understanding that your beliefs and practices are not shared and will never be shared by everyone, end quote. Hungerford here is parsing and perhaps misreading Charles Taylor, forces an encounter, she claims, with the potential meaninglessness or indeterminacy of our beliefs. But this very condition of insufficiency or lack, she suggests, confers a kind of religious authority on the purely formal, non-semantic, even meaningless qualities of language, as these have engaged figures like Allen Ginsberg, J.D. Salinger, Cormac McCarthy, Toni Morrison, Don DeLillo, and other American writers since 1960. Their works, in turn, Hungerford argues, give cultural prestige to a particular postmodern species of belief, a belief without content, a belief in belief, or what Hungerford also names a belief in literature. In Hungerford's argument, American literature post-1960 reconciles us to our spiritual condition post-1960, which is to be ever orbiting the twin poles of desire for conviction, the pole of belief, and assent to the indeterminacy of belief, the pole of meaninglessness. More congenial to the general reader concerned with literature and meaninglessness may be philosophers Hubert Dreyfus and Sean Dorrance Kelly's All Things Shining, reading the Western classics to find meaning in a secular age. Dreyfus and Kelly read the Western canon backward in order to retrace the steps by which we arrived at our current spiritual anomie. Monotheism, they decide, was the wrong turn. I'll get back to that. And to seek to recover from the ancients an openness to an often conflicting plurality of sacred goods, which they suggest characterized life well lived in Homeric times. This openness is also a receptivity to what Dreyfus and Kelly call whoosh experiences that add up to no singular truth, but which in shining moments restore meaning and fullness to the present all the same. Dreyfus and Kelly join McClure and Hungerford in their diagnosis of our age, in which the breakdown of religious authority has left a crisis of intelligibility in its wake. This is the spiritual bankruptcy sale from which the project of postsecular re-enchantment takes its materials, repurposing what serves from depleted forms of religion in a creative spirit of bricolage, in the manner of McClure's protagonists, or else discovering the sacred in erstwhile secular forms, like poetry or football. There is no essential difference, really, say Dreyfus and Kelly, quote, in how it feels to rise as one in joy to sing the praises of the Lord, or to rise as one in joy to sing the praises of the Hail Mary Pass, the Immaculate Reception, the angels, the saints, the friars, or the demon deacons. These are all football teams. I had to look that up. I know what the Hail Mary Pass is because I'm from Doug Flutie's hometown. It's nice, I suppose, to see these eminent scholars rethink the place of their discipline within the bounds of the secular, to reject what Charles Taylor calls the spin of closure, which is hegemonic in the academy, and to open themselves to the sacred whoosh. But I worry about these kinds of projects for two reasons. The first has to do with the readiness of thinking of this kind to sacrifice particular histories, content, and contexts to some essential sacred something. In defense of this habit, one might contend that the domain of religion, or the vaguer spirituality, is the one place where appeals beyond history and language are allowed, indeed required, that we do violence to whatever we mean by religion or spirituality if we fail to take such appeals seriously, to grant ineffability to the ineffable. What one person might see as the gap in a person's logic, says Hungerford, I'm quoting, I see as a whole world of belief in the non-semantic powers of language. This is a world where religion and literature collaborate, end quote. McClure tells warmly of a colleague in literature who newly converted with him to what he calls the stubborn persistence of the spiritual imagination, and equally unready to resort to the old master discourses, secular or sacred, to explain it, exclaims, quote, I have no language for what I am beginning to see, end quote. A condition that for McClure sums up the post-secular sensibility for readers and great writers alike. But it's one thing to admit to the inadequacy of our descriptive vocabularies, another to let an intelligibility gap stand in for a mystical experience every time. In the end, it seems, no more historical or theological literacy is required for this kind of move than was ever needed in American literary scholarship's more long-standing habit of secular presentism, the reflex that made of religion always a cover for politics, sexuality, or ideology, made even overtly theological language always about some other thing. Now we're invited to see instances of religious feeling or expression as pointing always to the same thing, something that readers know when they see it, but for which they lack words, or for which they supply words like whoosh. Dreyfus and Kelly suggest that the sacred charge a fan might experience when her team scores is what someone else who marched on Washington might have felt on hearing Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. This is a particularly egregious example of the kind of decontextualizing I mean. What end is served, I wonder, in abstracting the shimmer of numinosity, the summons to awe, perhaps even the neural or chemical charge identified with the sacred from its place in particular histories, communities, institutions, struggles. Perhaps to mute the various claims these may otherwise have on us by locating the sacred squarely at the level of individual feeling. Or, as Hungerford seems to urge, to balance our desire for religious conviction with our desire that others have their religious convictions too. Or maybe it's to nudge religion and science into friendlier conversation so we can hit up the Templeton Foundation for more money to map the neural pathways of prayer. Whether we want to line ourselves up with these kinds of projects or not, we do well to acknowledge that they too have histories, that their conditions of possibility open up along particular vectors, that they locate us in trajectories that mobilize and constrain us in particular ways. This brings me to my second worry. For all of its deafness to the multiple pasts of religion that impinge on the present, the post-secular disposition toward the sacred in these examples joins a good deal of recent thought in inventing another kind of past, namely the past of institutional religion as a once ubiquitous presence worn now to a faded remnant, a once robust but now impotent guarantor of truth and meaning. Dreyfus and Kelly offer an unusually subtle account of this decline, but the end game is the same, the exhaustion of religion in, always, its recognizably institutional forms as a source of spiritual plenitude. Religion, they say, once provided the sustenance that comes in experience of self-transcendence, creative bliss, or divine grace, witness among the testimonies of the Western canon, Paul's conversion, or Augustine's, Dante's heavenly vision, Luther's faith. Sadly, they tell us, the moment for such revelatory moments has passed, not simply because the world after 1500 is just different from the world that went before, but because the meaning-making possibilities that the monotheistic tradition itself nurtured in its focus on the singular truth of the Christian incarnation and then on singular truth, period, eventually wore themselves down to naught. Now even the vestigial believers among us can no longer assume, as our ancestors purportedly did, that there is one truth that satisfies us, one right way of being in the world. Our predicament would be unimaginable, say Dreyfus and Kelly, in the world of medieval Christendom, where, they say, the Church answered all of our questions before they could even be formulated. Precisely because it once gave us everything and now delivers so little, so this, and like accounts run, religion, as most of us recognize it, is no longer a live option. To which we might reply, of course we inhabit religious affiliations, structures, moods, and so on differently than our ancestors did. So too, it seems not outrageous to assume, did they. We believe differently, act differently, confront different realities, possibilities, and dilemmas than those who went before us. So did they. Why imagine instead that their spiritual lives were less encumbered, their questions less pressing or complex? Or that any around us now whose relation to religion more closely resembles those forms we project onto this imaginary, stable past are likewise unmoving, stalled at the same unreflecting stage? The myth of a once uniform and replete, now scattered and diminished religious past not only obscures the different pasts that inhere in and constrain the present, it also assumes a developmental model of religion that continues to drive the study of religion and to shape the way we talk about it in and beyond the academy. I know I don't need to tell this audience that there are those for whom religious conviction remains a live option in a secular age are a sizable and disparate group. Or that there are thoughtful people for whom the mystery of, say, monotheism is not exhausted, or for whom a Hail Mary really is different from a Hail Mary pass, a ritual bath from a midnight swim, for whom, moreover, these latter pleasures may well score higher on a given scale of neural whoosh, but who might also agree that this probably isn't the point. At the same time, however, and unavoidably, spiritual experiences and identifications that do take their distance, often insistently, from institutional religious forms are very much a part of the zeitgeist. Harold Bloom's description of his Yale students' Jewishness, an amalgam of imaginative literature, psychoanalysis, and a kind of Kabbalah, as he puts it, by which their Jewishness is lived confusedly, ambivalently, ambiguously, and partly, is likely to be true in some way of most of our students' spiritual anythingness, perhaps also of our own. So to return to the question with which I began, what then are we, scholars of American religion and literature, to do with the sacred? I'll conclude by venturing 3 recommendations, all urging that the sacred, articulated in whatever proximity to the religious, be given the richest possible contextualizations. The first is that we balance our care for whatever autonomy we wish to grant to literature as a form of expression against the danger of making literature a privileged site of religious authority in a secular age. In this, the three works I've taken up briefly can be placed on a spectrum. Dreyfus and Kelly see works of literature as gathering places for the animating ideas of a culture. They belong to the archive one might consult in search of examples of lives worth living in a secular age. But literature itself, for them, enjoys no privileged status vis-a-vis the sacred, any more than tennis or good coffee. McClure notes that there has been what he calls a minoritarian post-secular literary spirituality alive in American literature ever since the Transcendentalists, who were busy, quote, fashioning and refashioning their own unorthodox spirituality around ideas that were Buddhist and Vedantic, as well as Christian, as well as spiritualist, end quote. This minority tradition, as McClure sees it, achieves its most stable and durable form in literature. As he says, quote, it may be the fate of the kind of spirituality that's interesting to me to live on through the vessel of literature and the arts. I can't imagine how else it could reproduce itself, end quote. Now, if these forms of unchurched spirituality have been around since, say, the Masons or even the Vedas, we know that there are many ways in which they reproduce themselves. So McClure here comes close to affirming a kind of Arnoldian replacement story for literature, in which literature replaces religion as the humanities replace the study of divinity. It's Hungerford who moves furthest in this direction of the replacement story, christening what she calls the faith in literary form, particularly in those spaces where meaning and content drop away from language, as a privileged form of living religious faith in a secular age. If we're trying to rethink the secularization story of the profession, we might want to proceed with special care here. The second recommendation is that we seek to understand the post-secular impulse in literary studies in view of the forces that give rise to a developmental schema of good and bad religion, but without naturalizing that schema or necessarily endorsing its terms. I take the terms good and bad religion from religious historian Bob Orsi, who calls attention to their function in what he calls the embedded moral schema that has long governed the academic study of religion, and I would add the academic study of American literature as well. We might well wish to historicize contemporary expressions of free-floating, presumably untutored spirituality by linking their career to patterns of religious privatization or to the liberalization of Protestantism. But in its current usage, as a kind of shorthand for all that's good in religion, spirituality too easily functions in the scholarship as shorthand for good religion. Good insofar as it's spiritual, spiritual insofar as it's good, all the while seeming to float free of its own normative power. This is a version of a point made by Orsi and others, that spirituality as a disciplinary term for distinguishing good from bad religion emerges in the context of Protestant Catholic conflict in Europe and the United States, conflict whose resolution in favor of good religion, Protestant or Protestantized religion, the notion of spirituality frames as benign, democratic, and self-evident. Spirituality in this way comes to define both the essential quality in all religion and the common ground of opposition to bad religion, the implicit category into which we dump all purportedly constraining, undemocratic, backward forms of faith. Spirituality naturalizes this progressive history of religion and sets itself up as its most recent installment, the evanescence of Protestantism beyond Protestantism, the disappearance of religion into everyday life. Now, we can even want this, but I would warn us against reproducing its terms uncritically, as we risk doing when we assume a narrative of American religious development that begins in Calvinist constraint and culminates in our myriad spiritual freedoms. Finally, my last suggestion, taking note of the resistant intellectual consciousness that inhabits them, the relentless iteration of their radical newness, their eclipse of the particular histories that ground them, their characterization as liberating counters to religious limitation and constraint. Americanists might well ask, what's American about post-secular claims made in, around, or on behalf of American literature? Thank you.